Welcome back to the Vintage Cinephile. I'm Rod Richards. Today I'm going to be talking about the 1968 film If, directed by Lindsay Anderson. This is a film about life at a British public school for boys. And a reminder for Americans, public does not mean public in the American sense. And this school is more or less the equivalent of an upper echelon American prep school. The actual school in the film is Cheltenham College in Gloucestershire. And it's kind of like an Eton or Harrow, but maybe a notch down in terms of prestige. Like most of these schools, at least back in the day, there are all the trappings of upper crust British life. They play hockey and rugby. There are a lot of character building rituals like hazing and bullying. And all these rituals have preposterously arcane names for them, kind of like the stuff you would have experienced in a college fraternity in the US, at least up until a few decades ago. This school also has elements of what we in the US would call a military school. And schools like this traditionally supplied the officer corps of the British Armed Forces, as well as other managerial elites. In fact, at Cheltenham College, where this film was shot, there is a memorial shown in the film commemorating the 702 Cheltenham men who were slaughtered in World War I, which is an astonishing figure given the size of the school. Despite being the incubators of Britain's wealth and prestige, these British public schools were pretty rough places, actually. Apart from the often brutal corporal punishment, they were ancient, musty buildings that often lacked decent heat. There was zero privacy, and my guess is the food wasn't great either. There was definitely a belief at the time that physical discomfort made you a better man. And I think there's something to that. The director of If, Lindsay Anderson, was actually a Cheltenham man himself before going on to Oxford. So this film had a special significance for him. Lindsay Anderson was, by all accounts, a pretty impressive guy. He didn't make a ton of films, but he was highly respected for his talent and his intellect. And aside from being a filmmaker, he was also a film critic and a theater director. I'll link to some of his work in the show notes. The film centers around the character of Mick Travis, played by Malcolm McDowell, whom you'll no doubt recognize as Alex, your humble narrator from the 1971 film A Clockwork Orange. The character of Mick Travis in If was Malcolm McDowell's first major role, and his character is very interesting indeed. Mick is one of the older boys in the film, one level or grade younger than the oldest boys, who are called whips, and these guys are the disciplinarians at the school. Mick seems to be a mixture of learned obedience with a slowly brewing defiance. He comes back from Christmas break sporting a mustache, and he talks about having been with an East End girl, which I assume is code for working class, and I have to assume that hooking up with a working class girl would have been taboo for an upper middle class kid like Mick. In his dorm room, he's got pictures of soldiers on his wall, and you imagine that something's going to erupt in this kid at some point, but we don't know what. I found his behavior on screen to be sort of murky, hard to read, and this made him very interesting to watch. By the way, the character of Mick Travis also appears in two later Lindsay Anderson films, Oh Lucky Man and Britannia Hospital. And these films are considered to be a kind of very loose trilogy. There are a few surface level quirks in this film that are noticeable, such as that the film is divided into chapters, which seems like a pretentious touch. You often see that kind of thing in artsy French films from this period. And also certain scenes are inexplicably shot in black and white. As I was watching, I assumed that the black and white scenes were done for purely stylistic effect. But it turns out that in reality, certain scenes were shot in black and white simply because lighting those scenes for color would have been way too expensive. I had some confusion initially concerning certain characters whom I at first assumed were part of the faculty. And then I realized they were actually students. And this is both because I was unfamiliar with British public school culture and because some of the actors they have playing 18-year-olds look more like 30-year-olds to me. Overall, I found If to be a wonderfully strange film, in no small part due to the vast cultural distance between the themes of this film and my personal experience. If is obviously satirical and has a mixture of realism and surreal or dream sequences. But for an American of a later generation, it was difficult for me to tell how much of this was serious and how much was intended to be satire, because the whole thing seemed absurd to me, even the serious parts, looking at it from my perspective today. What makes the film fascinating is that so many of the themes in If are issues for which attitudes have undergone dramatic shifts since the time this film was made. Privilege, discipline, corporal punishment, homosexuality, elitism, and so on. And that makes this film almost a perfect snapshot of a major cultural inflection point in Britain. I was a bit surprised by the pretty open depiction of homosexuality in the school. So apparently this topic was not as taboo as I would have thought back then. Speaking of sex in British public schools, public school men in the past had a tradition of swapping flogging stories when they were sitting around the bar together, sort of the way combat veterans swap war stories. And I have heard that the prostitutes of 19th century Britain were well versed in the techniques of flogging their male clients, as this was frequently requested by these gentlemen. It turns out that when you imprison a bunch of adolescent boys together and regularly beat them with sticks, that tends to have lasting consequences. The depiction of public school life in If very much reminded me of the harrowing accounts of British public school life I'd read in George Orwell's Essays, and also in the children's book author Roald Dahl's book about his childhood experiences titled Boy. Apparently If caused quite a stir in establishment culture in England at the time. And despite winning the Palme d'Or at the 1969 Cannes Film Festival, the British ambassador to France petitioned to have the film withdrawn, calling it an insult to the nation. Actually, it turns out that there were two other films at Cannes that got more votes than If that year. Z by Costa Gavras and Adeline 31 by Bo Widerberg. But If was selected for political reasons. I found it satisfying to confirm that the major film awards were bullshit back then, just like today. There's a funny story about the release of If. Apparently it was given a big unintentional boost by Barbarella, which you may remember as an erotic sci-fi film featuring Jane Fonda. Barbarella was a box office disaster, and the theaters needed something to put in its place to recoup the losses. And If was one of the only films that was available and ready to go at that moment. So If went on to be popular in the US and in France, but apparently not so much in England outside of London. So that's all I'm going to say about If. Definitely check this film out and let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you for watching and see you next time.